Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's a good turn up, especially it's a very ceremonial event.
More than that, exciting event.
Exciting event, yes. Festive occasion. And we have Dr. Lincoln with us as well. So, is there anybody left in the Bahá'í world? Well, it's pleasure to have today, really a real pleasure, with us Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi, with whom we have been actually establishing this link between the University of Haifa and the Bahá'í World Center, the academic link, which has been going from strength to strength, I think, over the period of 15 years, from 2000, and she has been out of the Israel for the last 3 years. She's a professor, holds the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, College Park, holder of this endowed academic program since July 2012. She collaborates with a wide range of scholars, researchers, and practitioners to advance interdisciplinary examination and discourse on global peace. By the way, yesterday I think I mentioned to Dr. Lincoln 2 days ago, a very prominent Iranian scholar actually was stating, I told you as well 2 days ago, that he has good hopes for Iran because of the Baha'is and he's not a Baha'i, yeah? Because of the Baha'is and the call for peace that they are actually presenting and reflecting outside with their sincere amity, and it was very recepted very well among the community of the, shall we say, Iranian scholars. You know. Anyway, I'm sorry, I will continue. Dr. Mahmoudi has developed and promotes a sound scientific basis for knowledge and strategies to explore the role of social actors and structures in removing obstacles to peace and creating paths to a better world. This means that you have to come back here to this region.
Anytime.
Before joining the University of Maryland faculty, Professor Mahmoudi served as the coordinator of the research department at the Bahá'í World Center in Haifa, Israel, from 2001 to 2012. Previously, Dr. Mahmoudi was Dean of College of Arts and Sciences at Northeastern Illinois University, where she was also a faculty member in the Department of Sociology. Professor Mahmoudi served as Vice President and Dean of Olivet College, where she was instrumental in an institutional transformation that generated national recognition. Now, today's talk, the title of today's talk is Susan I. Moody, originator of the link between the Baha'is of America and Iran. And I would say that I made a small kind of research before going. I had the assumption or the hypothesis, small hypothesis before that, but I went to check because I wanted to see whether in all the books or the major books that are present among the Iran-U.S. relations, whether there is any mention of this kind of activity, which was also none. So this is another field that within which that we see that, well, at least there was some link of linking Iran and the United States, but again, because of the Baha'i issue, it's pushed aside and it's not mentioned at all. I'm sorry for this remark.
That's great.
The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Safar. It's very nice to be back. I don't know which is home yet. I've not been away from Israel long enough to consider Washington, D.C. home, but certainly this is a form of homecoming for me. And there are many faces around this table who are very dear friends and colleagues of mine, and it's been very nice to be back in this setting and to be with all of you. And I very much appreciate the invitation to speak at the Ezri Center, and I thank Amit for doing all the background work for all of us today. So it's really a pleasure to be here. What I'm about to tell you about Susan Moody I'm sorry, I can't do it in a half an hour or 40 minutes. It'll be about 50 minutes. I've tried to cut it down, but it won't do justice otherwise. So you'll just have to bear with me, and if you have to leave, you will leave. But Susan I. Moody occupies a distinctive place in the history of the Baha'i faith, and this presentation attempts to answer the question of who was she, and why is she considered this unique person that linked the Baha'i community of Iran with America. To answer that question, there's content analysis of over 300 of her letters that she wrote to friends, family, and a Baha'i community from Iran to the U.S. She wrote to them. And also another 100 letters of related people that you'll hear about as I tell you her story, who went to Iran to assist her in her work. Another 100 letters that are relevant to her story. I also, and these come from the National Archives of the Baha'is in the United States and the local archives of the Baha'is of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has a very interesting archives because it's one of the older established Baha'i communities in the United States. So the study also draws from relevant journal articles and newspaper articles and other documents. So when you look at the Baha'i chronicles describing Susan Moody, they present her as someone whose actions personified spirituality as daily engagement in the world through the power of deeds, and that she is considered as the first person to have forged a link between the Baha'is of America and Iran, a link that I would argue still exists to this day, because the Baha'is of America are major defenders of the Baha'is of Iran to this day. So it's a very interesting relationship, and you'll see how this was forged. In 1851, America was on the cusp of an organic revolution advanced by women. Susan Moody was born that year in Amsterdam, New York, just as the women's rights movement was gaining force. The cause was deeper and more expansive than the right to vote, although that was its greatest linchpin. Susan's birth occurred in the wake of two momentous women's rights conventions, Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 and in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850, heralding a new era. It was a time rich with women's voices, some of whom remain the most prominent in feminist history: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, and Ernestine Rose, just to name a few. They challenged the conventional wisdom about a woman's place in the world, in the workforce, in government, and in the home. They demanded political, economic, and social equality with men, declaring that all men and women are created equal. Weeks before the Seneca Falls Convention, another significant conference took place in a small village called Badasht in northern Iran, and that's relevant to this story. Some 4 years after the founding of the Baha'i faith in Iran, some 81 disciples and one lone woman got together at this gathering. And the woman is known as Tahireh Qurratul Ain, born in 1870 and died in 1852. She was regarded in Iran as a great scholar and a poet. And the primary purpose of this conference of Badasht was to implement the core purpose of a new religion, a new revelation, by a sudden, a complete and dramatic break with the past, with its order, its ecclesiasticism, its traditions, and ceremonials. A single audacious act accomplished this goal at Badasht, namely Tahireh's public unveiling before the gathered all-male audience, where she proclaimed the inauguration of a new dispensation, a turning point and a break with the past. Now, she would later be executed at the age of 36 in 1852 for essentially what she did and her beliefs. So back to America. The women's rights conventions followed one after another throughout the 1850s and 60s, drawing first hundreds and then thousands of women and the men who supported them. This was a golden age of women's activism known as the first wave feminism. The leadership of the movement, led in part by Christian women of influence and affluence, also launched reform efforts in education, poverty, and morality. A well-educated child of a middle-class family, it is likely that Susan Moody felt the first stirrings of her childhood in that quaking environment of change. Her family was conservative, but there is evidence that they were free thinkers in some arenas, including the question of equality. In their own religious practice, they were Scottish Covenanters. The two threads of early feminism were joined: equality for women and abolition of slavery. Susan's parents had immigrated to America from Northern Ireland with their families, and they joined a surge of Scottish-Irish Covenanters who settled and established communities in the United States, prominently in the Northeast. They first moved to Connecticut, but then they moved to Amsterdam, New York in 1847, because New York State was going through some very interesting changes. The market revolution had taken hold in that state, bringing about a wave of social and cultural change. Rapid manufacturing methods and means of production were giving rise to a new economy. So her parents, John and Margaret Moody, were drawn to this booming mill town of Amsterdam, which is in upstate New York and very close, about 80 miles east of Seneca Falls. And the Covenanters, this Reformed Presbyterian sect, was established in Scotland in 1638, and it's important to note this for Moody's story because this group had long suffered persecution back in Scotland. The literature is full of stories about Covenanters being slaughtered and thrown into prison for their practices of religion, and America provided them a new opportunity to advocate for their principles. By mid-century, American Covenanters were distinguished by their outspoken denunciation of slavery. Susan's parents had 5 children, 1 son and 4 daughters, and Susan is the 4th in birth order. And according to census records, her father was he sold household items. He was a farmer and a candle maker. The dying embers of the Victorian era were still alight in Susan Moody's childhood, but the idea of reform was everywhere. A religious revival movement of the first half of the century, known as America's Second Great Awakening, had taken hold in New York State with an evangelical spirit that not only changed religious practices, but also paved the way for other movements such as temperance, women's rights, and abolition. It was most often women who heeded the call, and as a young girl, Susan was at a dizzying center of this hue and cry. She attended a school called the Amsterdam Academy, which was established in 1839 as a female academy, but later became co-ed. And she must have struggled with the conflicting views on women's roles, because the idea that women's lives were domestic and private while men's were public and effectual still held sway during this time. And for her, it was a time of conflict in this relationship. It is easy to speculate from this grounding that the seeds of Moody's great attributes were sown in this small New York State village. She lived her life as the independent, fully realized woman. She never married, had no children. She defied convention, and did not allow her status to hold her back. She pursued experiences beyond the narrow confines of her hometown, living in several cities in America and abroad. She devoted her life to service as a doctor, a physician, at a time when few women did. She adopted the Baha'i faith, a new religion that was based on the premise of unity, equality, and other such principles. And although her parents were immigrants to America, she sacrificed a comfortable life for the rigors of becoming a humanitarian in Iran. Here is a picture of Susan Moody. I don't have anything younger than this age. Her accomplishments were so impressive that it is difficult to believe that she didn't finally come into her own until she was in her 50s. In her early adult life, she pursued the question of her personal identity and expression ferociously. So after graduating from Amsterdam Academy, Moody taught school for a while before choosing a direction in life, which was medicine. When she embarked to New York City to study at the Women's Medical College, it was a rare choice because women had a very difficult time finding medical schools that would accept them. Motherhood and domesticity were still the idealized paths for women, so higher education, much less professional practice, was controversial and radical. There was still enormous opposition to women physicians. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, she's pictured, was the first American woman to receive a medical degree in 1852, but she was rejected from more than 20 medical schools before being admitted to the Geneva Medical College in upstate New York, which is a very interesting story, and it's for another time to read how she got accepted.
Was very stubborn, though.
Very stubborn. Those who vehemently opposed medical education for women justified their rationales with dour predictions for the destruction of the very fabric of society if women were to become physicians. Anyway, Elizabeth Blackwell, interestingly enough, was among the founders of the Women's Medical College in New York City, where Moody began her study of medicine. But soon afterwards, she succumbed to the pressures of medical study. Especially, she would write later and recount that the dissection lab, which was a strain on her nerves, caused her to leave medical school at this time. Perhaps, I wonder if she had a dedicated mentor at this time, whether this failure could have been abated. Disappointed by the defeat of her dreams, Moody returned home to take care of her aging parents. Her mother died in 1873, followed by her father in 1890, and then Moody accepted an invitation from her brother, who at this time lived in Chicago, to go and live with him and his family. There she pursues an entirely different career in the arts. She had substantial talent in both voice and art, so she took voice lessons and enrolled at the Chicago Art Institute. The Illinois Women Artists Project lists Moody's name among its registered artists, noting that her medium as oils and sculpture, and her pieces were exhibited in the World's Columbian Exposition that was held in Chicago in 1893, and she's also listed as one of the artists displaying her oil paintings in the 1893 official catalog of the Illinois Women's Exposition Board. During this period, she also studied at the Philadelphia Academy for Fine Arts. She lived in Philadelphia for 3 years, and then to New York City, where she studied with the famous Impressionist painter William Merritt Chase. And in the late 1890s, she went to Paris to continue her studies with Mr. Chase, and spent a year in Paris. She was a serious and gifted artist, obviously, and was well into her midlife, but was unable to let go of the call to medicine. And so she returned to Chicago early in the 20th century and enrolled in the Harvey Medical College, and this time she prevailed, completing her medical degree in 1903 at the age of 52. During this same period in Chicago, her life transformed because she started, for 3 years, she studied the Baha'i religion. And for some of that period, she studied it with this very interesting early Baha'i woman from New York City, Isabella Brittingham, who is the granddaughter of John Morton, one of the signers of the American Declaration of Independence. Brittingham was from New York City, but she would travel throughout the U.S. to give public talks about the Baha'i religion. In fact, she wrote one of the first English books about the faith, covering its teachings as much as they had in those days, which wasn't much, in 1903, and also did a lot of comparisons of prophecy, Christian prophecy, with the teachings of the Baha'i faith. So Moody was drawn to this new and unfamiliar religion that was barely a half a century old, and she was, I think, attracted to these ideas of the concept of unity, of equality, and the hope of reconstructing a better world. I mean, in a sense, that's an environment that she was being raised in, but also an environment which many people at that time in the U.S. were exploring, wanting to know more about. And I think she realized that the religion, she must have found it interesting, because the Baha'i religion has no ecclesiastic class, and all people are valued, including women. And she saw in Chicago how that was the case, which I'll get to in a minute. And she may have also been drawn to the religion whose faithful suffered much persecution in Iran, drawing a parallel with her own parents' experience as Covenanters in Ireland. So Moody became, and I'm just showing you pictures, she's in that circle. In Chicago, she became extremely active. She was part of the Baha'i Temple Unity Convention, where a group came together, to decide how to organize a community, how to reach the external population, to advocate these important principles. She conducted children's classes for the Baha'is. She was part of a group of Baha'i women who traveled up and down north side Chicago to find property for the future Baha'i House of Worship, which is now established. Pardon? In Evanston, yes. So, and these were the women that she'd go with. And here they're actually on the temple grounds. And Moody is the one kind of to your right standing. She conquered her shyness. Her friends in letters said she was shy. She conquered her shyness to give public talks about the Baha'i teachings. She also studied Persian during this time in Chicago, because there was a young man who was traveling with his father, Aminullah Farid, as an interpreter. And so Moody started Persian lessons with him. Later she would become fluent in the language. Anyway, she had an active life. She had a good life in Chicago, successfully established her medical practice, but all of that would soon change. At the age of 57, Moody made up her mind to move to Iran. She received a letter from Abdu'l-Baha, who was then the head of the Baha'i faith, who lived in Akka, inquiring about her willingness to move to Iran, where she would provide medical care for the neglected women. In 1908, and here's the story, in 1908, a small group of American Baha'is had gone to Iran to visit not only the Baha'i places of history, but the Baha'is of Iran. During this time, a number of Iranian doctors approached these American travelers, inquiring about the likelihood of encouraging an American woman doctor to come to Iran to live for the purpose of caring for the women of Iran, who at the time were deprived of skilled medical care because they could not go and see a male doctor. On their return trip, as was traditional, the Americans stopped in Acre to see Abdu'l-Baha, and as was customary, they would talk about what happened, what was their trip like, what was taking place in Iran. We didn't have computers and internet, so we could do it quickly, so this was really very important. And when they informed him about this specific request, he asked whether they knew of such a doctor in America. And of course, Moody's name came up. And then the decision came that he should write to her, Abdu'l-Baha should write to her and see if she would be willing to move to Iran. And of course, this is what Moody tells her friends in one of her letters. I knew then why I had felt the urge so strongly to study medicine. I was obliged to study medicine in order to come to Iran. So her decision to go to Iran was instantaneous. She was very excited about this possibility. And her friends write that they were not very happy about her decision, that they felt she had just established her medical practice, she was getting very active in the community, Baha'i community, and so for them they felt that it would have been better for her to stay, but anyhow, these are just some tidbits from the various letters. Now, details are somewhat sketchy about her voyage in October 1909 from America to the city of Akka, but you can probably guess, by ocean, and then eventually to Haifa, and then from Haifa by horse and buggy to Akka. And she was traveling with a young man named Sidney Sprague, who actually, Mr. Sprague, as Moody referred to him, he was born in America, but had moved to Paris as an adult, and there became a student of the Baha'i faith, and also studied Persian language. And he was traveling to Iran to head up the newly established Baha'i school for the boys in Tehran, called the Tarbiyat School. They stayed in Akka for only a few days. Abdu'l-Baha met with Moody twice during her visit, and this is what he told her. You are to go to Persia. At first you will find things very difficult. The conveniences are not the same. Many people are poor and sleep on the floor as they have no beds. You must not look at their circumstances, but at their hearts. He told her that it was imperative that she and Mr. Sprague leave soon from Acre because the weather was going to get bad and they would present many challenges and difficulties for them. So she describes how she came back to Haifa, stayed at the Nasser Hotel, Nasser. Can't find anything about that.
I have to talk to Yosef and Al.
You do, yes. And she says that in Haifa, in one of her letters, she says Bahia Khanum, who's the sister to Abdu'l-Baha, asked her to examine one of Abdu'l-Baha's daughters, and Moody said she went to her bedside, examined her, finding her heart rather feeble. A heart stimulant had been prescribed, and her condition was stable. So these are little tidbits from her letters. Anyway, so they set sail the next day from Haifa, and they go, if you just look at that red, I hope that red shows up on the screen, but they went from Haifa to the Bosphorus, Istanbul, and then Bosphorus to the, help me, Red Sea? Black Sea. Black Sea. Red, green, okay. Black Sea is down. Okay, to the Black Sea, stopped in Samsun, I don't know, Samsun,
yes,
Trabzon, Batumi, Georgia.
That's right.
And via train through Tbilisi to Baku. In Baku, she takes a picture in a sea of men. Her dress is described as dark green, because she later said my dark green dress is in rags by the time she gets to Iran. Anyway, so this is the picture in Baku, and then she went to from Baku via the Caspian Sea to this Bandar Anzali, right? And then she set off really on a most difficult part of the journey, which I'll describe to you through her own letters. So her first views of Iran in the light of a morning sun, she said, was glorious. The roadsides and fields before them were laid out in beds of pale violet crocuses. There were many mulberry forests and rice fields, all very lovely, but soon the land would become less idyllic. They navigated through meandering passages of rugged towering mountain ranges with stops in villages of Rasht, Manjile, Qazvin. If you see Qazvin, it's kind of, you see where Rasht is? Qazvin, and then slowly look, show them, and then Tehran.
Yes, that's
So-
Rasht, Zanjan, Qazvin,
And Tehran. So that's the route, basically. The carriage, Moody wrote, is like a big, roomy hack. We have 4 horses, and the charge is per horse $15 apiece, which is a good amount. Beside this, we paid $6 down for relay stations, or post fees. Every time we change horses, which was 19 times, the driver gets a fee of 20 cents. So this is her description. Before they had traveled far, she describes the road becoming crowded with hundreds of donkey carts cluttering the center of the road. It took continuous yell from our driver to get them out of the middle of the road, Moody wrote. And as there were deep ditches on either side, their drivers are running and screeching and yanking and pulling to keep the poor little things from tumbling into the ditch. It took 4 days by horse ride from there to reach Tehran. And in a stop in Qazvin, she says, about 11 o'clock a.m., she writes, we were nearing the mountains. The air is dry and bracing, almost intoxicates. We follow the course of the large river. The road is often at the edge of a precipice. The mountains came into view. There are sheltered places. There are forests and wild olive trees, very ancient. And she witnessed the vibrant commerce of caravans and tea houses, and noted the fall flowers, the cosmos, marigolds, chrysanthemums. Anyway, moving through this region, you could imagine Moody scrutinizing her new surroundings, curious about the people, their culture, their way of life, their hopes, their dreams. They stopped for a brief rest at a tea post with the postkeeper, who was a Bahá'í, and he played some Persian music for them. And Moody says that the instrument reminded her of a banjo, and the instrument was probably a tar. If you've seen the instrument tar. Anyway, she says the next day dawned bright, and it was her 58th birthday, November 20th, and the carriage climbs higher and higher, and then she reflects very contemplatively about Iran. She says, we become more and more conscious of the great needs of Persia, to bring to her aid the right kind of help, to develop her riches, for these mountains are filled with ore and minerals. There are salt beds, new oil wells are being discovered weekly. The people must be brought into their own, Moody wrote, by education in all branches of industry, science, and arts. Tell our friends to study the language. There is such a need and opportunity to help these fine people, and now is the time. So this is back to the friends, her friends in the U.S. The year Moody arrived in Iran, as I said, was 1909. So what was happening in Iran? The country had a population of 11 million. 70% were in rural areas, including the nomads. The majority of the population were Shia, followed by Sunni, and then there were segments of the population representing other religions that were non-Muslim. The country was very diverse in terms of ethnic groups and languages. It was ruled by a weak Qajar dynasty and was dominated politically and economically by Russia and Great Britain. The Constitutional Revolution of 1905-1911 brought about the establishment of a parliamentary system, but led to a civil war and a period of continual strife and instability. And by late 1911, Russia forces occupied parts of northern Iran. which in effect put an end to the revolution. The aftermath of World War I further destabilized the country. Russia, the British, the Ottoman forces occupied portions of the country, and over 1 million Iranians perished during this time, largely victims of famine, but also the 1918 Spanish influenza epidemic. The 1906-07 Constitution recognized the legal status and rights of Christian, Jews, and Zoroastrians by granting them a seat in the Iranian parliament, but the Baha'is were denied legal rights since they adhered to a post-Islamic religion. During the first 2 decades of the constitutional revolution, the Baha'is, despite their lack of legal status, experienced limited measure of security and freedom, in large part due to the decline of the power of the Shia clergy. Literacy rate is about 5% at this time, and among women it's much lower. Public health facilities are basically non-existent. There is poor water, there is poor hygiene, poor sanitation, malnutrition. So infant mortality is high, and disease is high. And veiling and the seclusion of women and girls also did not help medical matters for women, especially in relation to obstetrics and gynecology. In fact, it's described that by mid-teens, young girls were married off through arranged marriages, and early and frequent pregnancies posed difficulties, and the preference for sons would mean multiple pregnancies until many pregnancies until male children were born. Anyway, the gap between husbands and the age gap could be wide, leaving many women widowed for most of their lives, and divorce was common and had grave social consequences for the women. So that's basically a quick setting of what happened in Iran during this time. The morning after her arrival in Qazvin, a village about 150 kilometers from Tehran, she writes, "I have not had a full night's rest in several days, as we always arrive late and start early. The next morning I was up at 8 o'clock, and just as my bread and tea breakfast were brought to me, the women began to come, the sick of Qazvin. They had never had a doctor, would rather die than show their faces to a man, and now, well, all the breakfast I was able to snatch now and then was gone. The next day I worked from 6 a.m. to 11:15 p.m., such a clinic." As she examined her patients, she was amazed at the sheer number of neglected medical cases that with the passage of time now manifested as chronic diseases. Again, she was struck by the dire health needs of the women of Iran. Their hearts, she wrote, are all out of whack on account of altitude. This country needs more than just her hands. Indeed, many women doctors are needed. In the afternoon, she was honored at a large Baha'i women's meeting in Qazvin. The room was packed with over 100 people, she writes. All the women wore veils back from their faces. The outfits, she said, showed many bits of pretty color, velvet and gold lace. There was chanting by several little girls. The women asked Moody if she knew any songs, and she sang "Softly His Voice is Calling," written by a Baha'i woman, Louise R. Waite, back in Chicago. That evening she spoke frankly to the men about the poor physical condition of the women. She suggested that they could do one thing to just very easily improve their situation, which was to provide them with air and sunshine. Bring them outside. Let them be out in the open doors. The women needed beds to sleep on, she said, as many slept on the cold stone floors and were suffering from rheumatism. And she knew then that women's equality and opportunity would be the most important arena of her service in Iran. After Qazvin, they traveled for another 2 days, and they finally passed the snow-capped peaks of the mountains near Tehran. And Moody's arrival in Tehran was November 26, 1909, U.S. Thanksgiving Day, she wrote in her letter. And she was welcomed by a large party of men who came to the hotel where she was staying in Tehran. And she said, I had to change my dress that was rags into a blue suit, and describes her attire, which wasn't very much. But anyway, she said that the first evening it was amazing, the warm reception that she received from the Baha'is in Tehran. And then she was taken to a home of a prominent Baha'i, a very prominent Baha'i, who in Baha'i circles is known as a hand of the cause of God, an important figure. The house was crowded with men, she described, but then her attention was drawn to the women, and she went to a separate room where they were gathered. And it astonished her that these 3 daughters of this man were studying English. And they spoke it with her, and they showed her their writing in English. And Susan was very excited about this and promised that she would return and talk to them. And that night she said, I had my Thanksgiving dinner in Persian style, sitting on the floor having delicious food and excellent fruit, melons, at the end of the meal. She then began to arrange her own visits with women, predominantly Baha'i women at this time, and she would listen to them, hearing about the poor health conditions, about the educational needs. And she was very impressed by these women. She describes them as having very strong personalities, very ambitious, always eager to learn more. She spoke with a woman by the name of Tahira Khanum, who is, here's a picture of her, a famous Baha'i poet and an early advocate of women's rights in Iran. Some people point out that it was rare to see a Persian woman with short hair like this at that time. She was very amazed with the capacity of these women. And then on November 27th, she writes in a letter that I have taken a 6-month lease on an apartment on 10 Avenue Ala Dole, those of you who know Tehran. Her 2-room home, 2 rooms, included her medical practice, very simple. She says, it is difficult here, but I think 2 rooms are quite nice. There are no closets, no bureau. And she said, I've constructed a curtain area to hang my clothes. It was simple, but she was pleased with the results. A month later, she said that a dozen women and children have come calling on me today with bringing Persian candy, half a dozen pomegranates and fruit juice. I hardly know what to do. I am so buried and smothered in love and sweet things. In the midst of all my work, my work goes on. My sign, my medical sign, was swung below the window yesterday. I think the news of my being here spread rapidly over the city, and the sign serves to locate the office and the dispensary of Dr. Moody, the American. Anyway, so her practice is launched, and she begins a very industrious life, which would sustain for the next 25 years. In 1909, the same year she arrived, a group of Baha'i doctors had established a Sehat hospital in Tehran, described as a modern facility and a leading institution of its kind in Tehran, and the group of physicians invited Dr. Moody to join them as a physician. One of the founding physicians, the man here, and his wife with Moody, Dr. Yunus Khan, wrote to the Baha'is in Chicago that each doctor is charged with a special department. We've asked Dr. Moody to be the superintendent and the gynecologist for women's diseases. Some sources say that this is the first time a hospital in Iran had this. I'm not including missionary hospitals, and I can't find enough about them, but in terms of a hospital in Tehran. Moody would collaborate with other physicians. In fact, she writes how today she said, I collaborated with a non-Baha'i doctor, and I found him very helpful, and we assisted together in an operation. I liked him very much and hope to establish present relationships with all of them. And this hospital offered free treatment to everyone if they couldn't pay. That was one of its mandates. Anyway, newspapers wrote about the American lady who They say that she not only does she know medicine, but also gynecology and obstetrics and women's diseases. They wrote an editorial about how she cares for all people, all nationalities, Muslims and others. So she received a lot of attention in the press in Tehran. So now, after all these private meetings with people, and by the way, here you see some of those veils that are pulled back. These are some of the people that she worked with, the children that she was engaged with. She constantly talks about her being overwhelmed in her medical practice, that she never has enough time to do what is needed, and that she has to be a midwife, she has to be a nurse, she has to do everything, and that she doesn't have enough equipment. She doesn't even have enough for, enough gauze and other things that are the essentials. And she describes beautifully in her letters some of the frustrations that in detail that she faces, and how she then she describes in one place, I'd like to find some young women who can learn to be midwives, who can learn to do some of these things without her always being present. She also saw firsthand the lack of education and common life experience among the women in Iran. And so she decided that she needs to communicate this to the American Bahá'ís. And at this point, the American Bahá'ís began to form the Persian American Educational Society, headquartered in Washington, D.C. In fact, its membership was open to everyone, Baha'i or not. And pleased with this development, Abdu'l-Baha wrote to them and said, if possible, change the name to Society of Persian American Interdependence. The Society, Society of Persian American Interdependence, because, he said, in the future it may include all points, such as commerce, industry, and education, so that spiritual and material results and benefits may be produced. In an article published in the American Baha'i News in 1910, the launching ceremony, which you see in this slide, was described as taking place in a home of Alice Pike Barney, a very famous socialite in Washington. Again, those of you may know her daughter Laura Barney became a Baha'i, and they held 300 members, men and women, gathered at her home in Washington, D.C. to launch this society. They had a representative from the Persian embassy or delegation, and an American, Mr. Charles Russell, who was the American minister to Iran. And Mr. Charles Russell is featured in front there where you see the name. This picture I just want to quickly describe. This is Moody's later years in Iran. She's seated next to Martha Root, another great Baha'i, and some of the others I'm not sure about. Some of you may recognize them. But anyway, this society became a very strong advocate for sending resources to Iran, especially in the form of not only money to establish Baha'i schools, but also scholarship funds for students to attend these schools who could not afford to attend. And here is a list of just some of the people who were giving scholarship funds. And they're from various places: Washington, California, Canada, Cincinnati, Ohio, Wisconsin, just to give you a flavor of what was happening. What I found most interesting about this society is they decided that they would gather up all kinds of catalogs on agriculture, mining, telephone, railway, machinery, and other supplies, and they would mail these to Iran. And they wanted the Iranians to find a translator who could read these in English and inform the Persian population of what's available, the technology that's available, and what they could use for their own development. They also proposed having an office open there to provide these catalogs for the general population in Iran. And then they also mailed weekly bulletins to Iran from the Departments of Agriculture, Education, the Interior, and the Marine Hospital Service. And the aim was simply that we can hopefully establish a commercial commerce, a kind of reciprocity between the East and the West, so that this would benefit both populations. Moody corresponded regularly with the members of this group, of this society. Here is her handwritten list: students, the father of the student, and the patron in America who sends a scholarship for this student. She kept meticulous records about these students, and she would mail these to America so that people would see how their money is being spent. In her letters, she would describe each child. You know, this one is orphaned, this one's father died recently, this one doesn't have shoes, needs clothing. It is amazing the energy she expended while she's practicing from 8 a.m. till 11 p.m. And so between 1910 and 1913, 3 American women joined Moody in Iran. One of them was Lillian Kappas. She is a teacher, a very important teacher that I'll say a little bit more about her. Then Elizabeth Stewart was a nurse who joined her, and you see Moody in the front, and I don't know who the other 2 are. And then you see that Dr. Clock, the woman in the back, she's a medical doctor. Dr. Clock also joined her. So 3 women: Lillian Kappas, Elizabeth Stewart, and Sarah Clock. They joined her, and in the Baha'i literature, this group is referred to as the first delegation of Western Baha'i women to reside in Iran. They weren't just visiting. At the same time, Qudsiya Ashraf on the far, sitting down on your far right. Qudsiya Ashraf, because there's this exchange going on between the American Baha'is and the Iranians. She was a very bright and energetic Iranian Baha'i who worked closely with Moody and became the first Iranian woman to move to America in 1911 to pursue a college degree. She finished her degree, returned to Iran, where she became a very successful teacher and a teacher trainer to other Baha'i schools throughout Iran. So at this point, the Baha'i community is very active in engaging and establishing schools, and especially a girls' school. And if you want to read more about that, read Dr. Shahvar's book on the Forgotten Schools, which is a very thorough analysis of that. But in 1910, Moody wrote to the Baha'is in America saying, "Yesterday in the afternoon, the Baha'is divided into 3 groups and went to 3 different gardens outside of the city of Tehran to discuss the subject of the girls' school and raise the funds. The meeting, which I attended, raised nearly $500. That is a great sum of money for Persia just now." In another letter written around the same time, she explains that the girls' school will start with 50 pupils, explaining that the girls are not yet educated in Persian, so we should not hurry to get an English teacher here. Let's wait and see how they progress in their native tongue, and then as we need, we'll bring teachers. And she said, "Please tell anyone who wants to help that it will take only $1.50 per month to educate a girl." And she continued, "There are many here too poor to pay, and this is the way to lift Persia from her otherwise hopeless condition. Do make a strong point of this to all the friends and help the brave Baha'is here." With the arrival of Clock and Stewart, Moody had a little bit help in her medical practice and dedicated more of her time to Lillian Kappas and the girls' school. And in 1911, by the way, these are various meetings that she had with people that were related to the schools in Tehran. But in 1911, the Tarbiyat School for Girls, that's the official name, was opened with 30 students. A quarter of them were not Bahá'ís. By 1934, the year that Moody died in Tehran, the school had an enrollment of about 700 and represented the entire Iranian society. 2 years after the school opened in 1913, the results of the annual examinations for the girls arrived, and Moody writes in letters, "In girls' schools, I don't know which to praise most, teachers or scholars." Referring to the students, such an advance in 1 year is miraculous. These teachers, who were totally untrained, have produced great results. She attributed this victory in large part to Lillian Kappas, because she was really working exceptionally hard to establish teachers for the school. And then she said, the girls' school is the greatest among all the schools in Tehran, that it had a very good reputation. And again, that's another story that is covered in other places. But it would be in 1920, 9 years after her arrival in Tehran, that Lillian Kappas would pass away. She contracted typhoid, and then died. And this was a huge loss for not only the students, the school, the Baha'i community, but also to Moody and her friends. There's a side note, but I won't bother you with that. But I'll leave it here for the time being. That's a nice picture, isn't it? To see all these wonderful students. Since the inception of the Baha'i religion in Iran, there have been sporadic killings at that time of its adherents. This was a very common thing, persecution and all that. And the persecutions were especially at the hands of the Muslim clergy. Moody was very well aware of these issues. She would write in her letters about incidences where Baha'is would be either attacked, tortured, killed, their businesses taken over. And she was also very careful at these times about her public appearances, where she would be in Tehran. So it wasn't that she wasn't aware, but around the 1920s, these attacks became a bit more frequently, took place more frequently. And in July of 1924, the unexpected news came to Moody of the killing, the ghastly murder of her friend, Major Robert Imbri, a U.S. vice consul in Iran. And this really shocked Moody. This episode is described in many non-Baha'i sites, but Major Imbri and his wife Catherine had become good friends of Moody's, and this is Major Imbri. And although not a Baha'i, Imbri knew about the persecutions, and he was aware of this. And at one point, he realized that Moody's home was in danger because there were gangs that were coming around, and so he approached the government officials and said, "Please post some additional security." And apparently that evening, Moody describes in a letter, a group suddenly appeared out of the darkness and rushed our building. And just as quickly, a contingent of police sprang up in front of them, raising clubs and forcing the crowd into retreat. The next day, Moody called Imbri and thanks him for this act of his. And then shortly after that incident, Imbri was violently attacked in a public square in Tehran, and he was killed. And they shouted, "He's a Baha'i, he's a Baha'i." So around this time, Moody becomes somewhat exhausted. And, she's lost Lillian Kappas. Elizabeth Stewart is not doing well because she contracts various diseases, and her health is failing, not Moody's, but Elizabeth's. And they decide to return to the U.S. And it's not permanently, but they decide to return to the U.S. and they stop in Haifa this time and meet with the then head of the faith, Shoghi Effendi, the grandson of Abdul Baha, and then went to New York City, where they had a reception for them at the Hotel Waldorf Astoria, the Baha'is of New York City. And then during her stay in America, there are many newspaper articles about her, very interesting ones. In one article, she takes an airplane ride, a short airplane ride, which is really interesting, and I just want to convey this to you. The article says, according to Dr. Moody, who contrasts her entry into Tehran, the capital of Iran, in a coach and 4 horses, where she went to spread the gospel of hygiene to the Mohammedan women, and her exodus in a flivver, a cheap car of doubtful vintage 20 years later, she sees no reason why aerial transportation should hold any fears for the women of today. So a very interesting article, and she's taken a picture with the pilot. Just gives you her sense of adventure, her sense of wanting to know more, learn more. Anyway, she stayed in Philadelphia during this time. This is her Aunt Jenny, and I can't find any information about Aunt Jenny. These are some Chinese women that she met in California. So you can see, in Tehran she was taking Esperanto classes, and in Philadelphia she took Esperanto classes, because one of the Baha'i principles is that you need an international language to facilitate communication and to dispel misunderstandings. And so they thought that, at that point, if you study Esperanto, was really thought to be this language. Anyway, so Elizabeth Stuart stays behind and dies eventually in 1928, and Moody returns to Iran with another woman, Adelaide Sharp, a Baha'i from San Francisco, who would become the first woman to be elected to the national governing body of the Baha'is in Iran. The Baha'is of Tehran again welcome Moody. She describes how she wasn't left alone for days. She said more than 700 the first week came to visit, and women, men, old friends. Words fail to express the joy of our homecoming. And she's older now, more frail, but she's still writing to the Americans, trying to get that scholarship money, tries to practice as she can, tries to help with the school as she can. She dies in Tehran on October 23rd, 1934. Her friends described it as she would have been 83 or 4, 83, I think. They described it as a heart stroke. Tributes to Moody poured from the west to the east and from the east to the west, literally. Just amazing tributes regarding this woman. Hundreds of Baha'is and friends of Moody's attended her funeral. These are images from her funeral. And a woman, Mrs. Sharp, describes scores of schoolgirls with flowers in hand walked in procession through the city for at least 1 mile to the burying ground at the Baha'i cemetery in Tehran. By the time of her death, the Tarbiyat School for Girls was widely considered the leading school for girls in Iran, boasting 750 students. It was a bitter irony that within weeks of Moody's death, the Ministry of Education in Iran would close not only the girls' school, but all schools throughout Iran. To summarize, sorry, but we're almost there. Moody had accomplished.
Looking at the number of pages.
I know.
I didn't say
You
it.
can't tell. No, I pages. Yes. To summarize, Moody had accomplished so much in Iran. Her medical practice reached thousands of women who otherwise would have been deprived of access to medicine. In addition to treating patients, she trained women in basic hygiene and nursing skills. She was tireless in the amount of time and energy that she dedicated to the founding and sustained development of the Tarbiyat School for Girls. Beyond these major responsibilities, she also founded moral study classes for girls that she would personally visit every Friday, that she personally developed a curriculum for, and trained teachers. And eventually her curriculum is reported to have been the same as that taught in the boys' moral classes. By the time of her passing, there were 16 such classes in Iran. Finally, Moody constantly collaborated with both Baha'i women and men in all aspects of community building and serving the greater Iranian society. Upon her passing, the head of the Baha'i faith, Shoghi Effendi, wrote a message to the Baha'i world, and this is where she becomes what the title of this talk is, the first or the originator of the link between the Baha'is of America and Iran. And I would like to end with this. The passing of dearly beloved Susan Moody deprives the Baha'i world of the far-famed pioneer who, through her indomitable spirit, ceaseless services, earned unique distinction. She forged the first link in the chain uniting the spiritual destinies of the cradle of the faith, Persia, and the community of its stalwart defenders, the great American Republic. Moody never stopped believing that she was living on the cusp of a new enlightenment, writing, in her word, that liberating forces at work everywhere are bringing about vast changes in the social order of the world. So this is her story, and I just ended with this little piece from Stephen Spender's poem about the truly great, that the names of those who in their lives fought for life, who wore at their hearts the fire's center. Born of the sun, they traveled a short while toward the sun, and left the vivid air signed with their honor. Thank you so much.
The newspaper thing.
Where did I come up with?
Yeah, the newspaper.
Where did I get it?
No. We just
would you like it?
Yes. If I may, before we start the questions, it's important to say that this is Etelat, which is the most widely circulated newspaper at the time in Iran, and the title reads, if I'm not, the death or the passing of one Persian lover or friend of Persia of Iran. So, I mean, they didn't regard her as a Baha'i; they regarded her as a Persian lover, which is very important if you talk about the context. I'm sorry.
No, that's thank you. I didn't show you one slide, but it was very interesting. Later on I can describe it because it has to do with the International Women's Suffrage Alliance held in Budapest. And she wrote to the American Carrie C. Catt, who was the president, on behalf of the Persian women. And it was a very interesting, anyway.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoudi, for
Sorry
opening
to take
up,
so long.
for revealing another closed chapter or unseen chapter of Iranian history related to the Baha'is, of course, and also within the Iranian-American relations. Floor is open to, please, Professor Gilbert.
First of all, thank you for extraordinary lecture. I remember your last lecture several years ago. Do you remember it?
Yes.
This is your second.
Yes, I do.
At this university. My question, I'm asking it as an historian. Can you tell us a little bit about the letters? To whom did she write?
Sure.
Where did you find the letter? Who organized them, etc.?
Yes, the letters
about the source
are all from the National Baha'i Archives in Evanston, in Wilmette, actually. Yeah. Yes, in Wilmette. So they're all from the U.S.
So she wrote it to her friends?
She wrote it to, well, so for example, I mean, I have their names. These are various women and men. It wasn't just to women that were Baha'is at that time in Chicago, in Washington, D.C., in New York City, in California, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and in between, I mean, Wisconsin, a lot of people. She wrote extensively. She also wrote to the administrative bodies, like the national body. She wrote to various committees, you know, like this the society. Pardon me. And they are basically, they're not, I mean, I don't know that I have them all, everything that she wrote. I don't know. I mean, nobody knows. But I just made a chronology of her letters by date.
Who collected
them? The archives. So these individuals, upon their passing or before, they would send it to the National Center, to the archives. Yes.
So hundreds of letters.
300 at least. They're in English.
Only
yes.
English.
She wrote some in Persian, but it was for the Persians, and it was more related to school things. She became fluent in Persian after a few years in Iran.
And the letters were never published.
The letters are not published, no.
But you should
I've-
say that the book is going to be.
I'm
coming
working
out.
on a
Yes.
book, yes.
Yeah.
God willing. You know, this is not my area, so I'm learning.
Okay. Great.
Yeah.
So we're looking forward.
Yes, and then there were letters of Lillian Campus, of Elizabeth Stewart, of Sarah Clark,
Oral Platt.
to their friends as well, and Oral Platts and others, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Larissa.
Sharon?
Thank you, as usual. This is a bit of a sideway, but I'm going to ask it. She spends almost 15 to 20 years as an artist. Have
Exactly.
you managed to find? I mean,
I haven't,
she
Sharon.
got into pretty important
I-
exhibitions. I mean, she must have
I
been
know.
a pretty good artist
Yes.
as well.
Sharon, I
no,
haven't.
No,
it isn't that. I've
Really?
called the Art Institute,
in Chicago.
and they directed me to the women's, remember the women's, Illinois Women's Art Council or something. They have records, but they can't tell me where I can locate her paintings.
And not what was the subject matter? What medium was she painting? I mean, you said
Oil and sculpture.
Nothing left of the information?
Nothing left of
I
it?
can't find it. And she and her friends started the, they started a society in Chicago for artists, which exists even to this day. It's changed a little bit. But you know, I may have to go visit the Art Institute and talk to someone there. I can't, I haven't been able to. We've called, we've tried.
There
I'm
are-
amazed.
There are no family members that came with
That
them.
I'm
Or
also,
collected her works?
The family immigrated from Ireland.
I
etc.
have,
But there is no others that came from the
I
family.
have
or-
found a grandnephew,
Okay.
but he says, all we remember is she was the aunt that was, they viewed her as crazy for going to Iran. I mean, I'll be very honest. They didn't think she was, what is she doing, So it's a distant thing.
It's
Yeah.
a lot of detective job. I have to
But
do.
I have to find this. I agree with you. I have to. She lived in Chicago with a woman for a while who was an artist, and they together started this club. The name will come to me, but I can't find anything.
It's
Yes,
very
please.
questionable if you are going to find anything now.
Yeah,
Right.
interesting.
Yes, please.
My question could relate to the first question. You showed documents of contribution that was being made to schools to be spent on students. Where was she getting the money, and who was sending? Or how was
Americans. Americans, predominantly Americans. And in her letters,
Baha'i American.
Yeah.
Baha'i American, sometimes not.
No?
It depends for schools. No,
Okay.
for schools it was sometimes not.
How many Baha'is were at the time in the States? Do you have any idea?
I would say 1909. At most, maybe several hundred.
Several hundred.
I think so. I don't think. Anyone in the room? I
I mean, beginning of the 20th century.
yes. I mean,
Several hundred. That's
I think so.
Well, it started only in 1903.
I was
more
gonna
or
say,
less.
it was
started
in-
1903. So
These are very early days of the Baha'i religion in America. Very early days. The first mention of it was at that exposition in 1893. So
Mainly in upstate New York?
it started on the East Coast. Those who accepted the Baha'i faith, you mean?
Yeah, but you don't know where.
Not in upstate New
Not
York.
in-
No.
Because
No.
That's a hotbed for.
No, it did not. It has nothing to do with
Okay.
upstate New York. No, Chicago was a hub. Actually, the first large community, by large I mean an organized Baha'i community, was in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Interesting. I know.
Okay.
There are books written about that community. Yeah.
any more questions? Do we know anything about her activities with the? I mean, you surely described the contact with the Iranian women in Iran.
Yes.
Was there any organized thing that she set up there in Iran? I mean,
She meets.
not for the Baha'is. I
No,
mean,
no,
generally.
no. She meets with a lot of women, but that's more smaller groups
Okay.
that are not Baha'is.
So
she
it
goes.
wasn't institutionalized.
No, no, no. Her letters are rich with all
Yeah.
kinds of details. Really, she was a great writer, and took time to write things. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Is it still Dahl? What's his name? Dahl, the archivist?
Yes.
Dahl.
yeah.
Roger.
Roger Dahl. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Did she manage to actually train any local people to?
She did.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. Lillian Campus especially trained a lot of local people. That was the whole goal, was to get the local folks to do what needed to be done. And again, I think your book touches on
But I'm
Campus's.
thinking more
Yes.
of medicine, not education.
Oh yes,
Ah.
she trained midwives eventually. She had at one point later on, she had someone helping her in her practice, people who she had actually trained with the basic stuff. Yeah. But always she needed forceps for giving childbirth. Never could get enough. Because the mail, you couldn't rely on the mail either. It was really difficult. Anyway, it's an interesting story. That in her at the age of 57, she decides to create a new life, and loved her time in Iran. She loved the Iranians. She loved the Persians. In her letters repeatedly, she talks about these people, their potential, the capacity, this country. I mean, you got a little bit of that from her letters. And obviously she enjoyed it. She had to go back. She couldn't stay away.
The house where she practiced is there?
I don't think so. No, no, I'm sure it would be near that hotel that Bagharov.
Oh, the Grand Hotel.
Yeah, it would be around there, I think, yeah.
Nice neighborhood.
Of course, yeah. In Tehran.
Yes.
Anyway, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very
So
much,
thank you very
Professor
much.
Shahbar.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
very much for having me.
And I would like to thank also Sasha Dehghani, Dr. Sasha Dehghani, that actually arranged this meeting.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So actually 2 weeks ago, delivered the lecture on the Bahá'ís of Germany, which was
yes,
very
I know.
interesting.
It's wonderful.
Yes.
Well, he's an expert on that stuff.
He's expert on many things. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to
this
see all
would
of you.
conclude our sessions of Baha'i study, Baha'i lectures in this year for this academic year, and hopefully we continue this next year.